Hello and welcome to A Day in the Life. This is the 116th program in the series. My name is Fred Hacker. I'm your host and community producer. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you'd like to see some of our previous programs, they're all available on demand. You can go to the Midland Cultural Centre website or to the Rogers Community TV website. You can click on the MCC, Midland Cultural Centre website, click on community programs, and then on a drop-down menu, click on A Day in the Life, and all the programs are available to you there. Well, our program is sponsored by both a seasons sponsor and a program sponsor, an individual show sponsor. And our season sponsor is Bales, Dishaw, Holloway Wealth Management, part of RBC Dominion Security. We thank them for their continuing support. And our show sponsor for this particular program is Ferguson Deacon Tawes, and thanks to Mike LaPlante and his partners. And I want to especially mention my friend Rod Ferguson, who was the one to suggest today's guest for this program. Well, I am honored to introduce Dr. Cindy Blackstock, the director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and a social work professor at McGill University. Dr. Blackstock has been described as Canada's relentless moral voice for First Nations equity. She's worked for decades as a tireless champion for the rights of Indigenous children and families in Canada. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you, Fred. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to welcome you and fascinated to explore your life and your causes with you. You were born in Western Canada. Can you tell us the area in which you were born?
Yeah, I was born in Burns Lake, British Columbia, and lived all around northern BC. My father was with the Forest Service, and some of your listeners of my vintage will remember the forest ranger stations and lookout towers. So often in places that were too small for a map. And we would move along with the fire season, so we moved quite frequently. And I am a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, which is in northern British Columbia, and we would go there to visit family on occasion, but most of the time we're just up in the bush, in the huckleberry fields.
Now, my understanding is that you did not attend a residential school, and in fact that you were off reserve for most of your education.
That's right. So remember in 1960, Fred, just 4 years before I was born, that's when First Nations folks were actually recognized as people and able to vote in elections, and also that we were able to go to post-secondary education. So I was only 4 years out from that when I was born into those circumstances, into what was called Canada, continues to be called Canada. So that was my early kind of experiences situated at that time.
And what was your classroom experience in terms of, were there other Indigenous kids in the class?
Often not, no. I remember there was actually one little girl in my grade 2 class, and I remember her, I can still see her a couple rows over, and her name was Cindy too. So I was just like, there's another Cindy. And she was a First Nations little girl. And then one day she just disappeared. And I always wondered, like, where are all the kids?
Yeah.
And the community always kind of had an answer for that. The non-Indigenous community said, well, you're going to grow up to be on welfare anyway, or grow up to be drunk Indians. And sometimes it was said directly, but more often it was just in conversation. Oh, there's another drunk Indian. That's what you're going to be. And that was regular there. Of course, there wasn't a lot of conversation about residential schools, which were running full steam in the 1960s and 1970s when I was growing up. There was even silence in our own community about it because the shame was so deep and the pain was so deep about these places. And when people spoke up, they weren't heard. Much like the survivors who told the truth about the children in the ground, they spoke up, and then people, oh, that can't be true. Not in Canada.
I read somewhere that one of the questions on your mind was, what did we do wrong?
Yeah.
That must be terrifying for a child.
When you're 5 years old and people don't like you, or don't like your family, then the way that you process that is, well, what did we do wrong? Mm-hmm. Why are people so upset with us? And that I couldn't figure it out, because when I looked at my aunts and uncles and the other kids I knew, they seemed like pretty good people to me. Yeah. And I never understood why there was so much hate for people who just wanted to grow up and be healthy and proud of who they were. And, I just didn't understand it.
In the education system that you experienced, was there much reference to Indigenous Canadian history?
It was really interesting, Frank. What we would actually be encouraged to play cowboys and Indians during recess, right? And everybody wanted to be a cowboy because you live longer. Being an Indian meant a very quick end to your play date. The other thing I remember is I was given an assignment about the Hudson Bay Company. And the detail was go home and make a Hudson Bay fort out of popsicle sticks. And so I did this thing, right? And I mean, the presentation was, what a great deal for the Indians, Frank. You walk into this fort with nothing but a bunch of furs, and you get all this cool stuff, right? And then fast forward from there, my next introduction was in Canadian literature to Duncan Campbell Scott. Okay. And all of the poetry, very highly racist poetry he read, and that was marketed as just, great, good Canadian fine art that we should all appreciate. No one talked about his day job, which I know you and I will talk about later. Mm-hmm. But this was the propaganda type of education that I was immersed in, and so were the other students in my class. Mm-hmm.
You were quoted as saying that you grew up with symbols all around that Indians were not worth as much as anyone else, yeah. And that you were expected to grow up and be a drunk and be lazy.
Yeah.
What were the symbols that you reference?
The symbols were both visible, but also the invisible. Whenever you turned on TV, you never really saw First Nations folks in a good form. It was always they're attacking these poor people who are in a covered wagon. They're savage. They don't know how to do stuff. And then on the visible kind of stuff was all those messages about, oh, well, Indians, like they're always on welfare. They're always on the take. They're never giving anything. And they never make anything of themselves. They're just lazy. All of that stuff was in the public parlance of that particular time. And it was reinforced in the education curriculum through projects like building the Hudson Bay Fort without ever thinking about what was happening around there. And the other thing that happened is there was a huge stereotype about who were the Indians. I grew up, I was West Coast, but I actually didn't think I was even meeting the grade of an Indian, because the Indians that everybody thought were cool wore the headdresses and rode horses. And that wasn't what we did. Right. So there were all these messages that confluenced together that said being an Indian means that you aren't worth it, and that your trail is going to be a different one from what the rest of humanity gets to path for themselves.
Now, despite all of those images and symbols and negative influences, you went to university and achieved 4 post-secondary degrees. And I want to just focus on that because you got a Bachelor of Arts from UBC, which was your first degree. And then you got a master's degree from McGill in management, and another master's degree in jurisprudence from Loyola in Chicago, and a PhD in social work from the University of Toronto. Cindy, those are very, very impressive credentials. And you did that against a backdrop where no one expected you'd go to post-secondary.
Yeah, I actually remember, Fred, here's another important thing. Actually, when I went to grade one, I was convinced I was stupid. Because when I grew up in the bush, I would be taught in a totally different way. I was taught, for example, to look at a huckleberry bush and describe all the things that I could see on the bush and all the things that it was connected to. And then only then would the ground be swept away around the roots and say the most important part is often what you don't see. That's where the real life source is.
Yes.
Then I went to grade one and I was given the public school curriculum. And after about 6 months of thinking I'm completely stupid and I'm doomed to do exactly what the community members thought I was going to do, which is flunk out and never make anything of myself, I realized you were smart in Western education to the degree that you said something that no one else could understand. And that was true through to the PhD. And that becomes seductive. I'll use words that no one else can understand. I'm going to study topics that no one else can understand. And yet I'm going to say I'm doing all of this so that I can make a contribution to the public. And that's why I have academic protections. That never made any sense to me. So I actually had to go full circle and back to the fact that often it was that wisdom I was taught before 5 years old that actually has been really the anchor for me to be able to move forward. It was that kind of teaching that really put me in a position to move forward in a positive way in my life. And that academic trail, as you know, there's no 2 degrees are the same.
That's right.
And in many ways, I think that was me following that huckleberry tour. I knew what I wanted to do, which was to work in company of others to try and remedy the inequalities for First Nations kids. And I also knew that I had a responsibility to educate myself better so I could do that. And that's why I moved around in those various fields.
One of my former guests, the former Chief Justice of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, told us on this program that she had a friend who was very smart, with whom she went to school, and who wanted to go to law school, and who wasn't able to get into law school because he wasn't bilingual. No, in fact, he was bilingual. He spoke his native language and he spoke English, but he didn't speak French, and he didn't get to achieve his life's dream. That had a tremendous impact on her and on her view of equity in this country.
Yeah, I think even now we're hearing the conversations about the Trudeau government mandating both official languages for the Supreme Court. And the fact that 95% of Indigenous peoples don't speak both official languages.
Right.
The important thing for people to realize is these languages for us are not neutral. These were beaten into us in residential school. They were part of the colonial doctrine. I can speak English. I can't speak Gitxsan because of colonialism.
Right.
So for me, like learning French, another colonial language, in order that I can make a contribution on the High Court or in anything else in public service, it just feels like more rolling forward of the colonialism. And that's why the appointment of Mary Simon is very important. She is bilingual. She speaks one of the languages that is spoken on the lands now known as Canada for tens of thousands of years.
Yes.
And if we're going to do this in a fair way, then every future appointment to the Supreme Court ought to know both colonial languages, and they ought to be able to speak an Indigenous language going backwards. We can overcome language barriers through translators. We can't overcome colonialism with the translator.
Right. Interesting point. Thank you. Let's talk about your employment for a while. You spent more than 25 years in social work in child protection and Indigenous children's rights. You began that in British Columbia as a social worker. And in your early years, you worked in group homes, and you witnessed something there that I understand impacted you greatly.
Yeah. So like my first job, though, was I was 4 years old and I was a pine cone picker.
Okay.
Yeah. We would go out with gunny sacks and pick pine cones in northern BC, and those were used for reforestation. And I still remember Brad, you'll remember the catalogs. Like those were like the kids' best friends, especially for those of us in rural areas. Yes. And I was able to order a crazy carpet with my pine cone picking money. So that is like the earliest job I had. But fast forward to working in a group home. Yeah, I remember working in this group home in Prince George, British Columbia. And the idea is of child welfare is you're taking children from places that are putting them at risk and putting them somewhere safe until their families can address the problems and kids can go home. But the assumption is you're putting them somewhere better. And I remember these girls, First Nations girls, being removed from a remote community. They were fluent in their own language. They were very intelligent young girls, and yet they're being thrown into this group home that was very different from the place where they were. And the judgment on them was, well, they need to get with the program and learn how we function in this world. There was no kind of appreciation for, well, maybe we should spend some time really learning about their world. What do they have to offer that we're not thinking about? How do we support them in a better way? And I saw so many First Nations kids coming through that group home door. And I started to realize that it wasn't because these children or their families were somehow not deserving. It was because there was a far bigger burden placed on these families than other Canadians. And they were given far fewer resources to address it. And both of these things were deliberate and done by the Canadian state.
In the mid-90s, you became the assistant to the social development director of the Squamish First Nation, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's Lower Mainland BC.
Yeah.
What was the focus of that position?
You know, I had worked as a child protection worker off reserve in North Vancouver. And then I literally crossed the street to work for the Squamish Nation. And I was so honored to be able to do that work with that community because they were really thinking then of very innovative ways of how do you actually meet people where they are? And in a respectful and culturally based way, really lift them up to be able to safely care for their kids. But what really shocked me is I was complaining off reserve when I was doing child protection about the lack of services that we had in the province. But when I crossed that street and was confronted with the federally funded public services, and this is important for your listeners to understand, the federal government funds public services on reserve, not the provinces. The most basic things that I would be, of course, off reserve weren't available there. And the nation itself would have to pay, or we'd have to do fundraisers. Just to give you an example, Brett, there was a young man who who had cerebral palsy and needed a standing frame. It was being held together with duct tape. So I did what I would have done off reserve, get the appropriate medical professional in there to say what the child needed, and then I submitted it to Health Canada. Well, Health Canada said, oh no, he can't have that. We just got him a wheelchair like 3 years ago. He's going to have to wait another 2 years. I said, are you kidding me? And then another child had a dietary supplement because they couldn't eat. And the family was living in poverty. So I put in the request supported by the medical professionals. Oh, no, we don't cover that. We'll have to go for special approvals. I said, well, how long does that take? And they said, oh, well, we're not sure. I said, you have until lunch. The next meal is lunch. You know, like it was just, this is unbelievable. And this is right downtown Vancouver. Yeah. Like this is not, these discrepancies weren't explained by, oh, they live in a remote area. And that injustice just struck me. It brought me back to those same ways of limiting, but except in terms of word, this was even more formalized. This was a government who was a co-perpetrator in residential schools, now choosing to give children and families less on reserve than every other Canadian, while weaving a narrative amongst the general public that they were actually giving them more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You became, in 99, the executive director of an organization called Caring for First Nations Children Society. Is that a precursor to your current organization?
Well, I kind of had a hand in naming both, which is why caring is in both. But that was actually, I don't get credit for that one. That was done by First Nations folks in BC who really had spent their lives really advocating to establish First Nations child welfare agencies. These agencies still had to follow provincial law and were funded seriously inadequately by the federal government, but we're making great strides at trying to keep kids and families in safe places. So they had developed this organization and I walked into it, and really they handed me a shoebox of records and then we built it together. And what it did is it trained social workers to really work in communities, because when they came out of the BSW, they were pretty much at the old let's build the Hudson Bay Port. There was very little in social work at that time. So we had to train them in community, and we did some policy work there.
In 2003, then, you founded, as I understand it, an organization called First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and you were and are the executive director of that organization. Can you tell us what the mandate of that organization is?
Sure. Well, the reason it was founded is out of desperation on my part. When dealing with those federal inequities, I thought, how is this possible? Like, this is apartheid public services. And this is at the time, by the way, you'll remember like the whole hoopla around Canadians, rah, 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 around ending apartheid in South Africa. And yet I was living it every day, seeing these families go through it. So we connected with other First Nations child welfare experts across the country and created the organization. It had really two mandates. One is create the knowledge base so that communities can draw from that knowledge to implement their own best solutions for kids. Number two, make sure that the communities have the resources and the space to be able to do that work in a good way. And that resources meant equitable resources from the federal government.
Now, I want to focus on some of the research that you've done for a moment. And I know you've done research on Indigenous theory. You've also done some research on identifying and looking for remediation of structural inequalities. And I'm just wondering if you can tell our viewers the kind of research that was undertaken.
Well, we wanted to present the government with a solution to this inequality. And I remember being so naive. I really thought, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to work with some of the best experts and First Nations folks who are doing child welfare across the country. And we're going to document these inequalities in public services, show them how it's harming children in ways that really perpetuate the removals we saw in residential schools, and then give them a fully costed out and structure about how they could remedy it within the government's ability to do so. So we ran that course, and we got a nice letter from the minister. Oh, we're going to review it. And then they did nothing. And then they said, oh, we need a more detailed study. So back at it again. And we did. We convened 20 leading experts, including 5 economists. We had lawyers on there. We had people who are experts in substance misuse, multi-generational trauma, community development. We came up with this another more detailed report with over 100 pages of spreadsheets showing where every penny would go to remedy the inequalities and how that was backed by evidence to help kids. The government sends another nice letter, and then they don't do anything. And, you know, I started to appreciate that this was actually one of the leading mechanisms of perpetuating colonialism. Mm-hmm. And when we look back at the long history of residential schools, the government has frequently known better and chose not to do better.
Right.
They chose not to do better.
Right.
So we had to change up our game and go to court.
Well, and that leads us to a major focus of this program. And I want to introduce this by saying that I suspect that many of our viewers never heard of Dr. Cindy Blackstock until 2016.
Sure, I think
but you became the symbol of a major human rights, a landmark decision by the Human Rights Commission. Can you tell us what, first of all, Tell us about the complaint. It was 2007 when you filed the initial complaint. Tell us what, and I know we've talked about a lot of the underlying research and structure, but if you can just sort of succinctly tell us, what was it that you were wanting the commission to find?
Right. So in that research, we were able to credibly document, and the government agreed, that First Nations kids in child welfare were getting 70 cents on the dollar compared to other kids, despite the multi-generational trauma, and that they were being denied other basic services like education supports that they should have got for any other child. But because they're First Nation on reserve, nope, they didn't get it. So we filed the case along with the Assembly of First Nations in 2007. And even then, I thought, we're going to file this and they're going to realize that they're the error of their ways and they're going to do the right thing. But no, they actually fought it tooth and nail every step of the way, and not on the evidence about what was happening for children, not even on the evidence that they were underfunding. They relied on technical arguments arguing the jurisdiction of the tribunal. And basically what they were getting at is no one tells us what to do as the government. They wanted to skate above the law. And so this thing goes on. And by the time the final decision comes out, the federal government was found to have breached the law on 3 different occasions, not by people like me, but by their own legal courts in the litigation of this case. But the tribunal was very clear. Canada was racially discriminating against children in ways that resulted in unnecessary family separations in levels that far eclipsed the number of family separations in residential schools. They were creating harms to children, some of which they will never recover from, because as we all know, children's development, when you get in there early, you can do a lot of good work that will benefit that child throughout their life. And then if you leave it too long, you're not going to have that same opportunity. And that it was linked to the deaths of some children. Canada was ordered to stop discriminating. It paraded out a couple of ministers, including Carolyn Bennett, the current Minister of Crown Relations. And they welcomed the ruling, and then they didn't implement it. So we're now at 19 non-compliance and procedural orders against the Canadian state.
I want to back up a little bit because given my professional background, I was fascinated by the jurisdictional issues that they tried to get the federal court to find that the Human Rights Commission had no jurisdiction, as you mentioned. Then they tried to get the case dismissed by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. They succeeded there, but then that was overturned. Then they appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal. It just fascinates me that they, rather than deal with the issue, which had been so clearly laid out, there was all this procedural nonsense going on for years.
Yeah, and on a political level, they were making all these statements about, oh, we're sorry about residential schools, and we've learned the lessons, and we're not going to do that again. And yet they're fighting in the courts. And so this whole disconnect, this cognitive dissonance between their actions towards this generation of children and what they were publicly putting out there. And it came to a point where I felt that they really viewed this case as a public relations problem versus really saying, oh my gosh, these are children. And there's evidence even in our own documents that we're hurting them and putting them in situations where their deaths are more likely. Shouldn't we be concerned about that? But I don't think even to this day they're concerned at the level of the child.
The government's immediate response, and I'm going to quote here, was that they were committed to full-scale reform of the child welfare program, but made no commitment to any immediate changes.
No, and the reform they were talking about is everybody else.
Okay.
So, and this has been the missing piece. It's never reform of the government. They're the perpetrator in residential schools. They were the perpetrator. There's a middle space there we didn't get time to talk about called the 60s scoop, where children were massacred. And then this stuff. And instead of waking up and thinking, oh my God, I discriminated against all these kids. What do we have to do to reform ourselves so we don't discriminate again? They try to distract. They say to everybody, the problem is actually not us. The problem is out there with all these reforms to child welfare that we are going to do. As the 3-time offender against First Nations kids, they somehow have the hubris of saying that they're going to reform child welfare.
Yeah.
No, they need to comply with the legal orders and reform themselves.
Right, right. Now, there's a side issue here that I want to just talk with you about briefly, and that is that the government spied on you.
Yeah.
Can you tell
Oh my
us,
God. Yeah.
tell us about that?
That was, I was invited to a meeting at Indian Affairs by chiefs to be a technical advisor, nothing to do with the tribunal. And they were told that if I was in the room, the meeting would not go ahead. And then I was guarded by a security guard because I voluntarily sat outside. But they put a guy about over 6 feet just to guard me, like literally standing across it. And this is as violent as I get, right? And so I asked myself, what is it that this kind of reaction? Like, this is so out of the park. So I did a privacy request. It took about 1.5 years to get the documents. But then they came on a DVD and I was scanning through them. And there were the things you would expect, right? Like they're talking about when I'm on little interviews and things like this. But then I started to see they were taking snapshots of my social media pages. And they would not only track down what I was saying, they would look at what other people were posting on my page and go then to their Facebook sites, etc., including 12-year-old kids who are posting in about saying, we're so happy we came to have a heart day. And then they would send around that child's identity to everybody in the thing. They were also mapping my personal movements. So they would say, oh, we're at a gathering, but she's not here. Or she is here. Or here's who she met with. And they had notes from a meeting I held in the middle of the desert of Australia. So they deployed over 180 public servants to follow my personal movements. And this is what's I think, a real blind spot in those who look at surveillance. They didn't get CSIS to do it or the RCMP to do it. They may have, I just may not have known about it. They got public servants like the Keystone Cops to follow us and then to do this kind of stuff. So anyway, it all came out to the public. I was very clear that I had the original source documents, but I didn't want the individual public servants who had done this to have their names publicized. I wasn't in this for revenge. I was in it because I thought someone has to say something, because filing a human rights complaint should not mean that the federal government is able to marshal its substantial state resources and try and scare people off like this. Fortunately, my life is so boring, they didn't find anything.
The government was ordered to desist, though.
Yeah.
Who made that order?
That was the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, as well as the Privacy Commissioner. Both of them said that behavior had to stop. And the tribunal ordered me $20,000 in pain and suffering, and I donated that all to children's causes.
Yeah. That's a side to that story that Canadians have to ask themselves, what's going on here?
Yeah, I don't even have a parking ticket. Like, I just think what I said at the time is, why not put all these people on the task of remedying the inequality?
Yeah. 180 of them could probably take that in some direction.
Yeah.
There are a number of issues that you have spoken on, written about, and I'd like to get your views on them if I may. I want to go back a little bit to residential schools, if we may. You've been quoted as saying the truth was there. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the people that is in my hero book is a man named Peter Henderson Bryce, who's buried in Beechwood Cemetery. I actually look after his grave with the authority of his family. And he was the chief medical health inspector for the Indian Department in 1907. And he went out and he found that the federal government was underfunding the healthcare of those children really severely. But they were giving the people here in Ottawa 3 times the amount of healthcare funding that all the Indians across country. He said, get rid of those inequalities and then implement good healthcare practices, like stop putting sick kids in with healthy kids, make sure the buildings are ventilated, make sure the children aren't malnourished, and you can save their lives. He was a scientist. He was actually one of the top public health officials of his time. He came back to Ottawa, put his reforms on a table. The Duncan Campbell Scott, who I talked about, said, no, we're not going to do it. It costs too much money. He even wrote to Laurier, who was in power then, and said, you got to do something. No response, no action from the government. So his report was leaked to leading newspapers and it was covered nationally. You would have headlines like they're dying like flies or absolute inattention to the bare necessities of health. And one of the people reading that was a lawyer, one of your contemporaries, Samuel Hume Blake, who said that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with the charge of manslaughter. Bryce continued to press for those reforms, and in 1922 he picks up this criminal theme that Blake had launched, and he publishes a pamphlet called A National Crime, detailing all of his efforts to save the kids. According to his family, his dying lament is that the work did not get done. And in many ways, that's how I'm feeling, is the work is still not done in terms of remedying those inequalities.
You have been quoted as saying that the early 20th century Canadian governments didn't dispute that kids were dying in residential schools, but they didn't think they were worth saving.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, Duncan Campbell Scott writes that they acknowledge that these children are dying at higher rates in the schools than they would in their own villages. But that alone does not legitimize a change in what their policy is towards the, quote, final solution of the Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott was saying that kind of language in 1910. Yeah. And that's not the only example. We need to, if you read John Malloy's book, A National Crime, which takes its title from Bryce's 1922 report, you're going to see people from all walks of life raising the alarm about what was happening in those schools. Canada having credible evidence before it about the harms and choosing not to do it. It wasn't a failure. When you look at the historical record, they actually deliberated about this stuff and chose not to take the action.
Yeah. You have been quoted as saying that despite Ottawa's public hand-wringing over past abuses against First Nations, governments still treat First Nations as second-class citizens.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can bring us up to date now. Can you catalog the current shortcomings?
Yeah, so there's a legal ruling that includes the phrase willful and reckless discrimination in a worst case scenario linked to the deaths of at least 3 children, unnecessary family separations and harms. That was from 2019 and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal.
Yes.
The inequalities that we talked about are still there. And I remember watching a child from one of the communities that has no water. And that child got up on national TV, and this is about a year ago, and said, I want you to know that we're not animals. That child in some ways really was saying it is that a non-Indigenous kid had told me years ago that discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money.
Yeah.
And that child was trying to say, maybe you don't think I'm worth the money because maybe you think I'm an animal. Yeah. That is happening on our watch right now.
Yeah, that's frightening. You again have been quoted as saying that instead of fighting First Nation kids in court, the government should be implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. Again, in the interest of time, can you just sort of tell us what you would identify as the most immediate needs in terms of implementation of that call to action?
I would say the top calls to action are all about ending inequalities and for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit kids, and also doing that in a culturally based way. That's got to happen ASAP. Stop fighting First Nations kids in court and stop fighting residential school survivors in court, like the St. Anne's residential school. Those survivors were literally shocked in an electric chair. And the government of Canada thinks it's worth your money and my money to litigate against these survivors, to deny them some basic measure of justice. That kind of nonsense has to stop.
Yeah. Tell me about the Spirit Bear Plan. The AFN have a plan, and there's been a call for implementation of that. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, so what has happened over the last over 100 years is Canada has had no holistic plan to address all the inequalities First Nations kids face. Spirit Bear plan says, get the parliamentary budget officer or some other credible source, the Auditor General, cost out all the inequalities in public services, everything from water to child welfare to public sanitation. Let's figure out what the big gap is and then develop something like the Marshall Plan to remedy it. You know, this is really important for us to understand is these inequalities could have been fixed. You look at how fast they rolled out CERB, or when they were trying to negotiate a trade agreement with that nutcase, Trump, in the White House. Never once did they say it was too complicated, it won't get done. Mm-hmm. The money is there when they want to address it. And if we accept that the money isn't there at any point, we are actually saying to kids, well, you know, we have other priorities. So the only way we have enough money to go around is if we racially discriminate against you.
Yeah.
We use racial discrimination as a fiscal restraint measure, and that's wrong.
The areas of shortcoming that the Spirit Bear Plan addresses are education, health, water, and child welfare.
Yeah.
Is there any priority among those items?
No, I always say to Canadians, think about this. What if today I made a decision that your child wasn't worth the money?
Yeah, yeah.
And let's say if I said it was, they're going to get 10% less or 30% less. And I then asked you to be thankful that it's not 40% less or 50% less. We cannot, as a country and as a people, a moral people, allow any level of racial discrimination in provision of public services for children.
There is a principle that was referenced in the human rights decision called Jordan's principle. I don't know how much our viewers know about that. I'm fascinated by what it stands for, and I'm wondering if you might just elaborate for us.
Yeah, so Jordan's principle is based off of a real little boy named Jordan River Anderson, who was from Norway House Cree Nation. And he actually had to spend 2.5 years in a hospital unnecessarily because the government of Canada and the government of Manitoba were buck passing over who should pay for care for him when he was discharged from hospital. If he was non-Indigenous, the government of Manitoba would have paid, no question. Sadly, he dies in a hospital, never having experienced a day in a family home because of his race. And this is in 2005. Mm-hmm. Jordan's principle is about ensuring First Nations kids get access to the public services when they need them. It shouldn't even be needed because we have a charter that already says that's the law in a country. Yeah. But there seems to be this duplicity in the law when it comes to First Nations kids. Canada, the House of Commons adopted it in 2007, never implemented it. And so we had to fight for that in the tribunal. It's been a subject of many of these non-compliance orders. I'm happy to say that thanks to the non-compliance orders and Jordan's family, there have been close to 1 million services given out to First Nations kids that they otherwise would have been denied. But it's important to know that the vast majority of those other children get without question. So there doesn't even need to be a Jordan's principle. It's just that the discrimination for First Nations kids was so deep that the Jordan's principle became a necessity.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could share with us your views on foster care. You've been quoted as saying that 163,000 children spent 66 million nights unnecessarily away from their families.
Yeah, that's actually Department of Indian Affairs' own data.
Is it really?
Yes. When we use the word overrepresentation, it's often too easy to say. I always try to think about what would it be like if I was one of those kids? And your kids probably do this too, right? Or grandkids and everyone in your, they think about it as how many nights till I see my dad?
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
How many sleeps? Yeah.
And when we looked at that for First Nations kids between 1989 and 2017, it was over 66 million nights of childhood, which is 167,000 years of childhood. That's the price of the federal government buck passing waiting, treating this like a public relations problem. And that's why it's so urgent that all of us, especially with the federal election coming around the corner, say to every candidate that comes to our door, what are you personally doing on each of these TRC calls to action?
Mm-hmm.
And are you going to stop litigating against First Nations kids and survivors in court? And if the answer to any of that is no, then move on to the next candidate.
I'll share a quick little observation with you. You will know much better than I that moving the pendulum in public opinion is very difficult.
Yes.
And I had a wake-up moment a decade ago when, more than a decade, actually closer to 15 years ago, I went to a Rotary International Convention. And one of the topics was Canada, a third world country.
Mm-hmm.
And their focus was on the Indigenous people of this country. That was a slap in the face to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that there were communities in Northern Ontario in such dire straits that they actually had to reach out for international aid. And one of the things you do before you are eligible for international aid is one of these groups, like Save the Children, have to come over with their assessors to really document that you are in that situation. The assessor from the UK came over to Northern Ontario, and this is after around 2015, 2016, I want to say. And that person had just come from the Sudan. And they said, although the conditions are different, the level of deprivation in these communities is equal. And these people ought to receive international aid. Wow. That's in our country. That's what we've allowed. That's where that apartheid public service. And also keep in mind, Fred, when we ask ourselves the question, are we a racist country? I ask back, why do we still have the Indian Act? The very same act that created the reserves, that forced those kids into residential schools, is still on the books. The government of Canada has got like a rubber stamp under that act where it says you are a status Indian and you are a non-status Indian. Imagine if I rolled that out to Canadians and said, what is your blood quantum back to the original boat of French, English, or the Vikings? And if it's 50%, you get a status Canadian card. Otherwise, you're in the second boat with the non-status. This is on the books now. So yeah. I say until that's gone and until we really reconcile with these injustices, that it is very much a racist country.
I'd like to seek your views on monuments and names on buildings.
Yeah.
Certainly very much in the news lately, the Edgerton Ryerson statue coming down and the name of the school being changed. And I think it's fair to say that there are those in our society who would say, yeah, but some of those people did some good things too. Mm. How do we balance that? How do we balance the injustices with the accomplishments?
Yeah, I think we have to take a step back and think, what is history really for? And when I think about what history is for, it's really to equip us all to fulfill that promise we have to the next generation. We all want our kids to live a better life than we had, and our grandkids, and to not just pass on these legacies of problems that get foisted from one generation to another. The history belongs to the people, not to the government. But what we have been subjected to in colonialism is propaganda. We have been told a story about the country that has not equipped us to really learn from the past in a way that won't pass on those harms to another generation. When I look at how we learn from the past, I think it's really important that we understand a couple of things. One is that propaganda was and continues to be a huge problem. In fact, up until just a couple of weeks ago, Parks Canada website listed Duncan Campbell Scott as a person of national significance for his, quote, advocacy for education. So that's right now on the Government of Canada's website. But let's go back. I think that one of the things that historians have taught me is that not all of our legacies are equal. And even, in fact, Duncan Campbell Scott, in one of those poems that I was forced to read back there in high school, says the shadow is afoot with the shine. And when we think about Duncan Campbell Scott, there's no equivocation, he is a Confederate poet. But he also was the chief bureaucrat on the residential school for 52 years, who was there and said no to those life-saving reforms and did everything in his power to punish Bryce or any other whistleblower. What legacy has the biggest effect? It's not his poetry. It's a multi-generational thing with residential schools.
Right.
And that's the thing that we need to really understand, is that we can't say because someone did something good in the weight of all these horrors that they foisted on the public, that somehow they're a good person. We have to recognize that, yes, they did that, but let's weigh these things accordingly. I've been working with Beechwood Cemetery, Marie Wilson, who's one of the TRC commissioners, John Malloy, the historian, Project Apart. And what we've done is we've gone to to the burial places of some of these key actors in residential schools. And as we have unpacked the story, we've had to put up historical plaques beside someone like Dr. Bryce, who was erased by history because the Canadian government didn't want you to know about him. Right. So they erased his story. And we actually put up a historical plaque and inspired school children to learn about him because he's an early example of the type of people that we need in society. Then Duncan Campbell Scott, he had a plaque, but it was glowing. None of this, to use his word, it was all shine, no shadow. So we put, a plaque up there that says Confederate poet and cultural genocide. This is what we need to do, is we need to understand that history is to equip us all to do better for the future generations. And that means that we need to be honest about what that history is.
Our time is running out, and I have a number of themes that I'd like to just get your reflections on. One of them is the immediacy of the need. You've been quoted as saying children only get one childhood.
Yeah. We can't wait. If we don't want to be issuing another apology and for what we've done wrong, we need to correct this. And the good news about it is it can be corrected. With the awakening of the conscience of the nation, at every turn, we have a chance right now to hold our federal government and provincial governments accountable to implement the solutions that are already on the books. And by the way, the awakening of the consciousness at every turn, that's what Dr. Bryce wrote in 1922.
Is it really?
Our chance right now is to do the right thing and actually listen and hold people accountable, because we're the kids' best shot. And if we don't do it, then we know based on history that we will be allowing another sad chapter to unfold. And we know better, we can do better. The question is, will we do it?
I'd like your views on the mandate letters that our federal cabinet ministers have been issued. I've had the pleasure to interview several of the current and past members of Justin Trudeau's cabinet. And in preparing for those meetings, I've read each of their mandate letters, and a priority in every mandate letter for every cabinet minister since 2015 has been, and I'll just refer to my notes here, the importance of moving forward with reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. How are they doing?
Not very good, according to historian Ian Mosby, where they've implemented very few of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. And again, like 19 non-compliance orders to treat this generation of kids equitably, I think speaks for itself.
You touched on the question of whether Canada is racist.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you that when this subject comes up in conversation, typically there are a lot of qualifications around it. Well, no, Canada's not really racist. It's just that. What's your answer to that question?
The Indian Act. I would say to Canadians, go on Google, look at the table of contents for that act, and imagine that it applied to you.
Mm-hmm. One of the other comments that I frequently hear is, but we've spent millions of dollars on our Indigenous people, and they're just wasting it.
Right. The Auditor General has looked at the issue. The issue is not what First Nations are doing with the money. The issue is that the federal government is giving First Nations far less. And what they try to do, and it's true, they create this illusion, oh, I'm announcing XYZ million dollars for water. What they don't tell you is how much that still falls short of what would be given to a non-Indigenous Canadian.
Okay, yeah.
That's always the missing ingredient.
Yes. I'm interested in the work that you do. Who you consider to be your audience?
Governments don't create change, they respond to change.
Okay.
And so I really feel that my responsibility is to have the evidence, to hold ourselves accountable to an evidence-based standard, but to have the conversation with the Canadian public.
Right, that's what I wondered. Yes, okay. You mentioned Dr. Bryce, and I understand he's been quite an influence in your life. There are a couple of other influences that you mentioned. One's a filmmaker. Tell me about the role that he played in your life. Eleniso
Bomsawin. She actually came to document the Human Rights Tribunal. You can watch that in a film called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. But as she was doing that, I learned about this remarkable woman who is now 89 years old, who's currently working on 8 documentary films and has spent her whole 50-year career at the National Film Board documenting the stories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples through their own voice. I recommend anyone who wants to learn more, go and watch her documentaries. And she's a pillar of elegance, of wisdom, and of strength, and she stands by the truth and she won't be moved off it.
We're almost out of time, but I'll just mention that Chief Dan George is one of the other influences in your life. I also want to mention that you have over 50 publications, over 20 honorary degrees, and I wish we could talk more about that. I also want to just recognize the work that you've done with a number of professional organizations, Boys and Girls Club, the Canadian Education Association, Alberta Association of Social Workers, and much community work, including with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I wish we had more time, but we don't. So I'll come back and thank you in a moment. But let me take this opportunity to thank our viewers. We always appreciate that you join us on this program. Thanks to our friends at Rogers TV, to the staff at the Midland Cultural Centre. I can tell you that the MCC is preparing now for a reopening. We hope that public policy will allow us to reopen that institution soon. Really want to thank our season sponsors, Kathy Bales, Michelle Deschamps, and Jeff Holloway. Our program sponsors, Ferguson Deacon Taz and Rod Ferguson for his suggestion. And I really do want to thank you, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. I have learned a great deal, both preparing for and speaking with you today. And it's very generous of you to give us your time. And I thank you for being with us.
Thank you. And I hope we can do it around a coffee table pretty soon.
That would be fun. Yes. Those of you who are watching, we can tell you this program is presented by the Midland Cultural Centre. Usually these programs are live, but because the MCC is closed because of COVID, we not only have no programs, but no revenues. So if you've enjoyed this program, you'd like to support the MCC, please go to the MCC website and the donate button. Thank you for watching. Join us next time. Bye-bye for now.